Hello and welcome to a new episode of Cinema 4D Fundamentals. I'm terribly sorry for the long break in between. I've got pretty busy with work, but now I'm back and finally with a new episode. And this time we'll have a deeper look into rendering. And what I want to teach you today is that the basic and fundamental understanding of global illumination. So when it comes to people who are new to Cinema 4D or to 3D software in general, they tend to use global illumination, but without really knowing what they're actually doing. So we want to get rid of this lack of information and tackle global illumination so that we get a full understanding of this. I highly recommend that you watch the episode number 6, the episode about light and rendering. If you're new to Cinema 4D, I go into details about how the light works in Cinema 4D. And in this episode, it's required a little bit that you know the basics. I will do, though, a quick recap about what we learned in the last session. So we learned that global illumination basically means that if we have a light source and this light source sends out a ray of light, then this light ray will get scattered into the scene and other objects will reflect light as well back to all the other objects in the scene. And the calculation of these light bounces, this is what global illumination do. And the benefit, of course, is that this behaves almost like in the real world. So light is scattered. It's a simulation still, but it's fairly accurate to the real world. So we get fairly realistic images. On the other hand, we have the more simple local illumination method, which doesn't have those in-between calculations of light bounces. With local illumination, just the first light bounce is calculated, and if we want to achieve a similar realistic rendering look, we have to add our own bounce lights in the scene, so that we can simulate, for example, the reflection of this red object in our scene, which will reflect a tiny amount of red light to the other objects, and we could put a tiny point light in front of the cube here and simulate the reflection of the red light here. Now quickly to the benefits and downsides of the different methods. The local illumination is a little bit more difficult to set up. You have to fiddle around with a lot of lights and the settings. You need to think about the intensity, the light color, the shadow quality, and so on to achieve the look you're after. The benefit, though, is that you have unbeatable render times with it, and you don't have to think much about the render settings. When we have a look at global illumination, then the light setup is much more easy because we only need a few lights. In some cases, we just need a physical sky, for example, and the rest is done by global illumination. The downside is that we have higher render times, of course, because the engine has to calculate all the light bounces, but we get more realistic looking images, and this is what most of the people are after here. There are a few downsides of global illumination, which are, for example, spotty shadows or artifacts in your scene. They're especially recognizable in animations. This part right here is not that bad anymore nowadays. The global illumination engine of Cinema 4D or other 3D render engines are quite good with global illumination nowadays, so it's really easy to get rid of those things. So when it comes to the decision local illumination versus global illumination, I have to admit that in most cases you probably want to go to the global illumination, but there might be some cases, for example, you only have a fairly slow computer, maybe you're a student, but still want to do an animation, or you, I don't know, just want to learn a lot about lighting. Then I can highly recommend to try and set up a scene with local illumination. You will learn a lot of things about the light setup in Cinema 4D. And in a later episode, we will have a look again at the difference between local illumination and global illumination. But before we go to that, this is, by the way, the scene we will do. We want to have a fairly good understanding of what global illumination is, and then we can go into the scene and play around a little bit with global illumination, but also try to recreate this scene with local illumination. That's up for the next episode. So this episode we will focus on understanding global illumination. Okay, so let's have a look at the render process with global illumination inside of Cinema 4D. So whenever we hit the start rendering button, what Cinema 4D will do when we have global illumination activated, it will do some kind of pre-calculation before it renders the final image. And this pre-calculation is also called sampling. Cinema does this in two different steps. So the first method is also called the primary method, and this is where the first light bounce is calculated. So we have a light ray coming from a light source, and this light ray hits the surface and then gets bounced one time into the scene. And this is the first method Cinema calculates, and this is also the most important one. This makes the most amount of light in your scene, and thus this is used as a special primary method. Then afterwards, Cinema calculates the secondary light bounces, also called the secondary method. Now all the light bounces up from the second to whatever number you define basically will be calculated by the render engine. Now then this information is passed on to the final ray tracing rendering. And this is where all the other parts come in, all the reflection, the blurriness, shadows, the anti-aliasing and so on will be calculated and will be put together with the information which are gathered in the first step and combined to the final rendering. And this process, the pre-calculation, could also be called something like a light distribution calculation, because basically the light which distributes in our scene will be calculated with those two steps. So keep in mind, the primary method is the most important one. This will define, for the most part, the quality of your scene. And the secondary method is not that important. It will just add up a little bit light and a few more details to your scene. Now let's have a look at what this sampling could look like. There are different methods. We will come to that in a few seconds. This is now the visualization of the sampling with light mapping. And as you can see, what Cinema does, or the render engine does, is it samples the color or the intensity, the brightness of different spots in the scene with different amount of samples. So we can define, for example, that we only want 10,000 samples in our scene. And you can see that we have quite big spots scattered around in this scene. When we turn up the samples, you see that the little spots get much more finer and much more smaller. Now the advantage of that is that, of course, the more samples we have, the more detailed or the more accurate the light distribution in our scene will be calculated. The advantage of using lower samples is that this goes much more faster because Cinema only has to calculate 10,000 samples. So the best thing is probably somewhere in between. We don't want too many samples to be calculated, but we also doesn't want to have too few samples, because otherwise we on the first hand have not an accurate light distribution calculation, but also the overall quality of our image could suffer. Now why do we use this kind of sampling method in Cinema 4D? It's basically something to save time, because we don't want to be super accurate with calculating the light distribution. As it turns out, we don't need 100% accuracy to calculate a good looking rendering. And therefore we use this kind of sampling to speed up the render process. The downside of it is that, of course, we have a certain error margin in that sampling process. And it's up to you to define how much error margin or how much errors you want to have in your scene. Cinema gives us a couple of different render algorithms to calculate the primary and the secondary methods. There's, for example, the in the primary method, we can pick between the irradiance cache and the quasi-Monte Carlo. When it comes to the secondary method, we can again pick between the irradiance cache, the quasi-Monte Carlo, also light mapping, or the radiosity maps. Now, as I said, the primary method is the one which defines the quality of our rendering, and therefore the quasi-Monte Carlo and the irradiance cache are the render methods or the light distribution calculations which have the best quality but also the longest render times. In fact, it's that quasi-Monte Carlo is the most precise and the render setting with the best quality, but it also takes the most time to render. We then have the irradiance cache, which is a little bit faster, but also is not as detailed and accurate as the quasi-Monte Carlo rendering. Now in the secondary method, we can now combine either the irradiance cache or the quasi-Monte Carlo with our first rendering method, or we can pick another one. Now, if you want a super detailed high quality rendering, you could go, for example, with the quasi-Monte Carlo in the first primary method and also go with the quasi-Monte Carlo in the secondary method. But this could lead to very long render times. So you might want to pick, depending on what you want to do, the quasi-Monte Carlo for the first primary method and choose a much faster method for the secondary method. This could be, for example, light mapping. There are a lot of different combinations you can choose, and you can have a look into the Cinema 4D help file and see what are the ups and downs of using the different combinations. The ones which I pick usually if I do interior scenes especially is the quasi-Monte Carlo for the final rendering and the light mapping here in the secondary method. If I do the preview renderings, I also pick the irradiance cache for making the previews and also light mapping in the secondary method. So the light mapping is a really fast secondary method with a quite good light distribution in your scene, especially useful if you want to do interior scenes. Okay, so now let's have a look in Cinema 4D to get a better understanding of those methods. Okay, so we are back in our example scene of an interior. And we want to start with the render settings. And the first thing we want to do is we want to add the global illumination. And this will be the only render effect we will use for now. Make sure your render is on standard. We will cover the physical part also in this session. So pick the standard and go with global illumination. And by default, you see that the primary method is selected, the irradiance cache, and we don't have any secondary method. For the samples, we have this set on medium, but we'll come to that later. Now, let's have a look when we select the quasi-Monte Carlo. You see that we have much less settings here to do with the quasi-Monte Carlo. When we pick the irradiance cache, you see that we have a special irradiance cache tab, and here we can define more settings of the irradiance cache. So let's start off with the irradiance cache and have a look how that works. Now, when I hit the render button, you see that the image is calculated. And you see now this is the pre-calculation process I talked about. The irradiance cache samples, all the dots you see, is the sampling of the scene, and we call those dots the records. And the record density, which you can set in the settings, defines the distribution of those sample points in your scene. So this took about 30 seconds now, and when you have a look up here on the ceiling, or maybe also on the back of the wall, or at areas like in this corner over here, you see that we have a few spots in here. Let me see if I turn on the filter and increase the contrast here a little bit, you might see that a little bit better. So this is something we call artifacts or spotty shadows, and this is some kind of problem you have to face when you use the irradiance cache. Now let's see what we can do to increase the quality of the irradiance cache. So the first thing we have here is the samples, and you might think, okay, well, we could increase the accuracy of the samples, which is defined here in %. but you can also switch to a custom sample count. But I would recommend that you stay with the custom accuracy, and then Cinema will calculate the best sample count for you and for your scene. Now let's try something else, and let's say we go in the next step way down with 10% accuracy. So what we might expect now is an image which is way worse than this one. So let's see how that turns out. So again, this is now a little faster. We saved about 10 seconds. Let me turn off the filter here for a second. You see, so again, this is now a little bit faster. We saved about 10 seconds. Let me turn off the filter here for a second. And you see, of course, we still got the shadows, and it gets worse as we expected. But I would say it's not that worse. I mean, we turned down the accuracy by about 60%. And of course, it's more spotty, but it's not that worse. So we have to find another setting where we can increase or decrease the quality of our irradiance cache. So let's turn that back to about 75%, and let's have a look at the irradiance cache setting. As you can see now, this is set to medium. And what we can do, for example, now is we can set that to high. And let's see now what we come up with that. As you can see now, we have a much higher record density in our scene. So we have a lot more samples scattered in the scene, which will calculate the light distribution for us. And we also have now a longer render time. Okay, so this took now about 3 times as long as our first rendering. Let me turn on the filter again, and you see the light distribution is better now. We don't have that many spotty artifacts in the corners, but we still have this kind of spotty ceiling. Now let's do a quick last render, and we go back to the irradiance cache tag, turn that back to medium, because the ceiling is not that much better with the high setting. And we turn back to the accuracy, and let's see what happens when we turn that back to 100%. Okay, so that has finished too. And now we have a pretty clean looking image. I turn on the contrast setting again, and we see it still looks pretty clean. There are a few spots still, but that's not the problem of our setting. Or maybe we could increase the quality, of course, a little bit if we picked the high record density. But as you can see, the most effect you get is by using the accuracy tag in combination with a medium or a high irradiance cache record density. So the record density will not define how many records or samples you will have in your scene. But the most important part is to have a high accuracy on those samples in order to get a clean looking image. So the problem with the irradiance cache is that you, in some cases, still have a bit of those spotty shadows or spotty areas going on in your scene. So let's have a look at the more advanced quasi Monte Carlo method and see what that does for our scene. For now, let's start off with the 75% again and see what this does. And also keep in mind the render times. For this, we had now a render time of 1 minute. And I'm on my MacBook Pro, so that's not the fastest renderer I have at hand right now. So if you have a better rig or a better CPU, then the MacBook with an i7 at 2.6 gigahertz, I think, then your render times will be much faster, of course. You can see now that the with the QMC, with the quasi Monte Carlo, the pre-calculation is not happening before the actual render, but it's combined into the render process. So it's finally done, and as you can see, we have now a render time of 8 minutes. So the image looks good. We don't have any spotty shadows going on in our scene, but it took quite some time to render that image. Again, I'm on a fairly slow MacBook right now, so don't focus too much on the render time. But as you can see clearly is that the render time is much longer than with the irradiance cache. Now, Quasi Monte Carlo is a pixel-based renderer, which means that it calculates every pixel in your image and then defines which color this pixel should have. Because of this, the image could get grainy. So this is also the downside of the Quasi Monte Carlo. Whereas in the when you use the irradiance cache, you have the downside of, oops, sorry, those are some images we come to later. So the downside of the irradiance cache are those spotty shadows. And the downside of the Quasi Monte Carlo is the graininess. Now, I think that a little bit of graininess or noise in your image is actually good because it looks more realistic. Our eyes are so adapted to looking at photographs which always have a little bit of noise in it, so that we think that images which have noise in it are a little bit more realistic. So this is why the noise of the QMC actually isn't that bad. But let's see what happens if we turn down the accuracy of the Quasi Monte Carlo down to 5%, just for an example, and let's see how the render times and the image quality will turn out. Okay, so the render has finished, and as you can see, the render time has decreased quite a bit, but also the noisiness and the graininess has increased in our scene. Let's have a look. Let's go back to the first rendering, which took 8 minutes, and this one, which took about 3 minutes. And as you can see, I hope you can see it with the compression of YouTube, the graininess, but when I go and zoom in, you can probably see it good enough. Okay, so as a quick recap, Quasi Monte Carlo, much better quality, much better shadows, much better light distribution in your scene, but takes a lot longer to render. Irradiance cache has more settings, so it's a little bit more, not difficult, but you have to go into the settings a little bit more, and you have the problem of the spotty shadows. Now let's have a look at the secondary method. We go back to the irradiance cache and turn that up to about 75%. And we keep the record density at medium. That seems fine. All right, so let's pick the light mapping. This is my favorite secondary method for interior renderings, but also I use this quite a lot for basically everything I do because it's so fast. So here we go with the light mapping, and let's go back to our last image. Let's pick this one with the irradiance cache, and now let's do another render and see what comes out. Okay, here we go, quite a fast rendering again. As you can see, we still have to face a little bit of those artifacts here, but our accuracy is not at 100%, so that's fine for now. And let's see, so this is the first rendering we did with only the primary method activated, and this is the rendering with also the secondary method activated. So as you can see, the light mapping adds up a lot of light into our room. And it's clear, of course, because the secondary method calculates all the light bounces which goes on into this room. Let's have a look at the settings again. We can define a maximum depth here for the light mapping. And let's increase that a little bit and see if we can spot any differences. Okay, here we go. what is also worth mentioning is that although we use the secondary method, our render time hasn't increased by much. Well, let's see if we can spot the difference now between those images. And as you can see, when using a higher maximum depth here in the settings for the light mapping, you can see we can add up a little bit more light into our scene. But it's very subtle. So if you want to get more light into your scene, you can choose other ways. For example, use more light, or I will introduce another nice tool for you in the next episode. Let's have a look at the light mapping settings for short. Now, this is the path count over here, and this is what I was talking about in the beginning of this lecture. So the lower the path count, the less samples you will have in your scene when using the light mapping method. The more you have, the more paths will distribute into your scene, and the more detailed or the more accurate your light distribution of the secondary method is. We can try to pick something fairly low here and see if we can spot any difference again. So as you can see now, the render time decreased a little bit because we only have about 10,000 samples going in on the light mapping in our scene, but you can see that we have really a problem here with artifacts in the corners. And this is because the sample rate is too low. And well, the render doesn't have enough information on these kind of spots here. And it's interpolating one sample, for example, or this it's just one sample here, so this is because, and it calculates that this is a light spot here, so this is why there we have some kind of this light leak going on. And then another area, maybe here, it's just have calculated that this is a more shadowy area, and so it puts a shadow there. And as you can see that this low sample count really looks not that good. And also what's interesting here is that just by increasing the sample counts by this huge amount up to 5 million, that the render time is still quite good. You can also define the sample size right here, but most of the time you can leave that by default and go with the path count. If you want to visualize how your samples are distributed in your scene, you can activate the mode right here to visualize, and then you can see the samples. So maybe let's go back to the 10 and let's see how the samples actually look like for this setting. So as you can see, this renders quite fast, and now you can see why this problem occurs, because we have a lot of different colored samples right here in our scene, and this is a fairly inaccurate method to calculate the light distribution. So when we turn that back to about 5,000 times 1,000 and visualize that again, it'll take a little bit longer for the renderer to calculate that, of course. But as you can see now, the distribution of our light looks much better. So those are the most important settings for the light mapping you want to know about. Okay, if you want to know a little bit more about those primary methods and secondary methods, you can just do a right click and open the help file. And in here, you will find all the information about the different rendering methods and also about the combinations and all the settings. So I hope I've covered the most important parts about those. So keep in mind that not always you need a secondary method, but if you want to light up your scene a little bit more and make it a little bit more realistic, I highly recommend to use a secondary method, and my favorite is the light mapping. If you want to render, do preview renderings or don't have too much time to render, I would say pick the irradiance cache. If you have a fairly good computer or even a render farm and want to create a highly realistic, good-looking image, then go with the QMC method in the primary section. Okay, so you might have heard about the term biased and unbiased renderings. So what's that? If we have a look at this pre-calculation sampling process, then we can say that this is a biased calculation or a biased method, because it takes information and uses this information to go to the final rendering. So it basically has some pre-assumptions before we do the final rendering. It has gathered light information and will take this information to do the rendering. An unbiased rendering, on the other side, is a renderer, which also often referred to as a physically based renderer, is something where we don't do any pre-calculation on the scene and just go fully into the rendering and render the light distribution on the go. Now, this turns out to be in some cases a little bit more realistic. This is why this is also referred to physically based renderers, because they calculate the light as if it would behave in the real world. So let's have a quick look at how that could look like. And I prepared something here with Arnold. This is a third-party renderer, and then we don't need that. So basically the same setup. We have a physical sky. We have the a few of the Arnold lights over here in the window, and well, an infinite light going from the side. So I didn't put too much time in the setup here. I just want to quickly show you how an physically based or an unbiased render engine looks like. So I start the rendering by opening this render window, and here you see another one. And now what the render engine does, it just starts off with a very inaccurate distribution calculation of the light, and then it will add detail after detail, round after round, and will increase the accuracy and fill in all the gaps, more or less. So you can see the first rounds were quite fast, and now as it gets more accurate, more detailed, each thing will need a little bit more time to render. And those renderers are also referred to as infinite renderers, so you could just keep them going on, and at some point finally the image wouldn't get noticeably better. But well, that's the idea of a physically based or unbiased rendering, that you just keep the render on and it keeps on going and calculating unless you set a certain limit to it. As you can see now here in the middle, it's now fairly detailed here, and as you maybe can see is that it's also a little bit grainy still, but well, so that's the idea behind an unbiased renderer. And just let that do one more round here, and then we can have a look at that. Okay, so it took quite some time, about 7 minutes, to come to this point. And I had to increase the settings a little bit more so that we get rid of those graininess. But this is the basic idea of the unbiased rendering, that you keep rendering as long as it's necessary to create your final image. And the benefit of it is that the light distribution is quite good and fairly realistic, and so this is why you can get quite realistic images with it. Okay, so let's have a look at a few of those render engines, the third-party render engines. One of the most popular ones is V-Ray, and it's not per se an unbiased renderer, but you can optionally turn that on, as far as I know. And so you get quite nice looking images with that. And then there's, for example, Octane, which is I think a fully unbiased renderer, which is also GPU based. So that means it's not rendered on the CPU but on your GPU, and therefore it can be quite fast if you have the proper equipment. And then we have Corona Render, which is also quite new and quite nice, I think. Also really realistic images are possible with that. Now, one word maybe to the realistic rendering images. It's not only the render engine which will define the quality of your renderer. So if you want to create photorealistic images, you also have to spend quite a big deal of time with setting up the light and also with setting up the textures and the materials. Those are also very, very important. So if you want to create images like that, you don't just need a good render engine. You can come quite far with this also with the standard render engine from Cinema 4D. And also most of those third-party render engines are quite expensive. So some of you might say, so well, there's a physical based render engine in Cinema 4D, isn't there? Actually, there is not. But you're right, there's a setting in there when you go to the render settings. Over here, you can choose the physical renderer. But this is not a physical based ray tracing, light distribution render engine. What the physical renderer in Cinema 4D does is it just calculates or emulates a realistic camera, a physical camera. So let's go back here in our scene, and I've prepared something for that. So I've put here the camera, it's just a normal Cinema 4D camera, but we have this physical tab over here. And if you activate the physical render engine in Cinema 4D, what that is good for is you can create realistic looking photographic effects, like for example lens distortions, vignetting, chromatic aberration, or also depth of field and motion blur. Now for the depth of field, I've created a little example right here. So let's switch to the physical camera. As you can see, we have a little bit different focal length on this camera, so that we have a nice focus on this cube here in the scene. And if you know nothing about how cameras work, I highly recommend for you to, I don't know, look in the internet or buy a book about how you make photos in real world, because then this knowledge will come in handy here. For example, to create depth of field, an important part is on the one side the focal length and the sensor size of your camera, but also the f-stop. So I picked a quite low f-stop for this, and I also I'll not just go back to the default values right here, and we do a quick rendering of this. We go back to the radiance cache though, because we want the image to render fast. Okay, so I hope that wasn't too fast. Here we have activated the physical render, so we have still Global Illumination on, although that is not necessary. And we turn on the physical render engine with the setting automatic and the shading error threshold of 10%. So this should give us a quite good looking quality of the image. So as you can see now, the depth of field worked quite good. We have our object here in the center in the focus, and the background is nicely blurred. Now, one thing maybe to setting that up, what I did is I added the cube right here into the focus object, and now the camera will always focus on this cube object. Okay, now let's have a look at the other settings right here. So for example, we could increase the vignetting effect. Let's turn that up to about 80% and maybe the chromatic aberration to about 60%. And then we do another render and see what those effects are. Okay, so now you can see that the vignetting and the chromatic aberration is applied to our renderer. So the vignetting is, if you don't know that, is the overall darkening in the edges or corners of your images, so this is also an effect which is created by the objective, I don't know, by the lens of your camera. So this is a lens effect, and also the chromatic aberration, also an effect which is created by the lens. And this is this shift of colors on edges and corners. So you see we have this blue area right here and this more red looking area on the other edge. And if you compare that to our first rendering, I think you get the idea. Now, the vignetting and chromatic aberration, as I said earlier, is also a good method to make your image look more realistic. It's again that we're used to those kind of effects when we look at images or movies, and thus we perceive those images which have those effects in it a little bit more realistic. So use the physical renderer if you want to create photorealistic images, or if you particularly want to use those photographic effects. Now, maybe back to the pros and cons of this. As I said, when you use the physical render in Cinema 4D, it's really good for realistic motion blur and depth of field effects. And also it can be faster when you use the physical render and you want to use motion blur and depth of field. It not only looks better, but it's also a little bit faster. So keep in mind, it's good for photographic effects, and it's not a physical renderer which calculates the light in your scene. The cons is that when using those effects, render times can be a little bit longer, but still, if you use motion blur and depth of field with it, it's still faster than using depth of field or a motion blur with the standard renderer. Also, something like depth of field is actually really hard to do with the standard renderer. You need basically just do that in the post by using so-called depth maps. There are also a few other downsides of it is that you cannot use it with Sketch and Tune or Pyrocluster or a few other things in Cinema 4D. So when you want to use those, you are stuck with the standard renderer. And also the images tend to be a little bit more grainy than without the physical render, but still, again, this is something which is actually not that bad. It adds up to the realism of your image. But just keep that in mind that you will always get a little bit more grain in your image when you use the physical renderer. Okay, so again, this is the scene we will do in the next episode. It's a little bit more hands-on. I hope you've learned a little bit about the how Global Illumination works and how we can use it in Cinema 4D and why we have the primary and the secondary method. And yeah, well, a big thanks to all of you. If you want to be updated if I've released the next episode, make sure to subscribe, and I'm also happy for every like, and also I received a few donations, so big thanks to those people. Really happy about it, and I try to increase the quality and also the make a few more videos in the future, so any feedback, comments, or help is appreciated. Especially in this episode, I tried to make it a little bit more precise, a little bit more condensed, so that you don't have to watch a 1 hour long video. So yeah, well, tell me if you like it or not, and I'm happy for every feedback. Okay, see you, goodbye.